The sky above the courthouse was gray, heavy, and waiting. Inside, a small boy sat alone on a wooden bench, his tiny hands clutching a worn teddy bear while strangers debated his fate. To the system, he was just another case number, another file in a cold stack of papers. To him, it was the day the world decided whether he would ever see his family again. The lawyers spoke in circles. The judge barely lifted his eyes, and every plea from the child's guardian fell into silence. But what no one inside that room knew was that justice was already thundering toward them, not in the form of lawyers or politicians, but in the form of roaring engines and hearts made of steel. It started miles away, in a dusty garage that smelled of oil and rebellion. A group of bikers had heard the boy's story, how the system had failed him, how greed had stripped him of everything, and how no one seemed to care. They weren't saints. They didn't wear suits or carry briefcases, but they knew what it meant to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves. The leader, a man everyone called Bear, slammed his fist against the table and said in a low, determined growl, "If the court won't protect the kid, we will." And in that moment, Destiny mounted a motorcycle and rode straight toward the courthouse. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse square was silent, until the first engine roared to life in the distance. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the sound grew into a symphony of thunder. Windows shook, pigeons scattered. People turned to see a wall of black leather and chrome speeding toward the building. They weren't coming for chaos. They were coming for truth, for the child who had been abandoned by justice itself. Inside, the judge's gavel froze mid-air as the rumble echoed through the walls. The bailiffs ran to the doors, but it was too late. The bikers had arrived, dozens of them, their jackets bearing the same emblem, a flaming skull with angel wings, and the words Sons of Mercy. The leader stepped forward, removing his helmet slowly. His eyes, weathered but steady, locked onto the judge's. "We're not here to start trouble," he said, his voice deep and calm. "We're here because you forgot who justice is supposed to protect." In that instant, the room fell silent, not from fear but from truth. The child looked up, his eyes wide, his small heart daring to hope again. The world had always told him that heroes wear uniforms and speak from pulpits. But that day, he learned something different. Sometimes, heroes ride motorcycles. And when justice goes blind, they make sure it can still hear the sound of thunder. The courthouse had never seen anything like it. The roar of the engines outside grew louder, vibrating through the marble floors and rattling the windows. Inside, the child's case was reaching its cruel conclusion. The judge was moments away from signing the final order that would take him away from the only person who had ever loved him. The boy's foster guardian, a frail woman with kind eyes and trembling hands, whispered, "Please, he's just a child." But the courtroom was cold. The system had already made up its mind. That was when the doors burst open and sunlight cut through the shadows. The Sons of Mercy entered like a storm of conviction. Their boots echoed on the floor as a dozen bikers filled the hallway, not with anger, but with presence. At their front was Bear, his leather jacket weathered, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. "We came for the boy," he said firmly. The bailiffs moved in, hands hovering over their weapons, but something in Bear's tone, calm, grounded, and unshakable, made them hesitate. The crowd held its breath. The courthouse, a place usually ruled by protocol and fear, was now governed by something far more powerful: truth. The judge demanded order, shouting that the law would not be intimidated. Bear didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "The law," he said quietly. "You think the law is this building, this robe, these papers?" The law was meant to protect the innocent, not sell them to the highest bidder. The judge's face paled. Around the room, even the court clerks stopped writing. For the first time, someone had said what everyone had been too afraid to admit. The boy stared at the men before him, not with fear, but awe. He had seen bikers before, in movies or on the road, but never like this. These men weren't here for rebellion. They were here for him. His small hands tightened around the bear he carried, and in that silent gesture, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. Outside, a crowd had gathered. People filmed from the steps, some whispering, others cheering. What began as a small-town custody case was now turning into something far greater, a battle between the heartless machine of the system and the raw, untamed force of justice that refused to stay silent any longer. As tension thickened, one of the lawyers shouted that the bikers were breaking the law, that this was an act of violence. But Bear took a step forward and raised his hands, palms open. "We didn't come for violence," he said, his voice deep and steady. "We came because the system forgot its humanity. We came because no child should grow up thinking the world doesn't care." Behind him, the other bikers nodded. Their presence wasn't chaos. It was order born from the ashes of neglect. The judge tried to regain control, slamming the gavel again and again, but each strike sounded weaker, less certain. "You can't fix injustice with threats," he barked. Bear looked at him calmly. "We're not threatening," he replied. "We're reminding." His gaze softened as he turned toward the boy, reminding the world that some lives are worth fighting for, even when the law forgets. Then, something unexpected happened. A woman in the gallery stood up, a social worker who had seen the case unfold. Her voice shook as she said, "He's right. The child's file was buried. The evidence that could have protected him was ignored." The courtroom gasped. The lawyer stammered. The truth had been hidden, but not destroyed. The sound of her voice broke the spell of bureaucracy, and the air filled with a sense of awakening. Bear turned back to the judge. "You see," he said quietly, "this isn't rebellion. It's justice finding its way home." The judge, overwhelmed and shaken, didn't speak. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of engines outside, steady, unwavering, like a heartbeat. Finally, Bear knelt beside the child. "You're safe now," he said softly. The boy nodded, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, someone had stood up for him. Not for money, not for power, but because it was the right thing to do. Outside those courthouse doors, justice waited. Not written in law books, but roaring in chrome and gasoline, ready to take the boy home. When they stepped outside, the afternoon sun struck the courthouse steps like fire on metal. Reporters had gathered, cameras flashing, microphones trembling in nervous hands. The crowd had doubled, drawn by the thunder of engines and the scent of something far greater than news, truth. The boy stood between the bikers, his small frame dwarfed by their leather and steel. Yet somehow, in that moment, he looked the tallest among them. He didn't hide behind them. He walked beside them. It wasn't rebellion the people saw. It was protection, unfiltered and undeniable. Bear raised his hand to silence the crowd. "This isn't about us," he said. "It's about every kid who gets lost in a system built to forget them. Today, that ends." His words rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Behind him, the other riders started their bikes, one by one, until the entire square shook with the rhythm of defiance. It wasn't noise. It was a message. Every rumble said what words couldn't. That real justice has a heartbeat. The authorities tried to intervene. Police cruisers rolled in, sirens wailing, officers shouting for the bikers to disperse. But Bear didn't move. He took off his jacket, revealing a faded tattoo of angel wings stretched across his back. "You want to arrest me?" he said to the nearest officer. "Do it. But make sure you tell the world that today, a group of so-called criminals cared more about a child than the system built to protect him." The officer hesitated. His hand hovered over his radio, but something in Bear's tone, something painfully honest, stopped him. The other officers exchanged uncertain looks. They weren't seeing outlaws anymore. They were seeing men with scars who had found a reason to fight for something pure. Slowly, the sirens faded, replaced once again by the steady hum of engines and the sound of a child breathing freely for the first time. The crowd erupted in applause. Tears fell. Strangers embraced. What began as an act of defiance had become a declaration, a reminder that compassion is stronger than control, and that sometimes justice wears a leather jacket instead of a robe. That night, the courthouse became a ghost under the weight of what had happened. The headlines blazed across every screen. Motorcycle Club saves child from broken system. The story spread like wildfire, igniting debates, admiration, and outrage all at once. Politicians condemned it as an act of anarchy. But the people, the ordinary, forgotten people, saw it for what it truly was, a miracle with wheels. Back at the club's garage, the Sons of Mercy sat in silence. The boy, wrapped in a borrowed jacket too big for him, watched as Bear leaned over the table, staring at a photo of the club's founding members. "We never set out to be heroes," Bear muttered. "But sometimes, the road leads you where you're needed most." The others nodded quietly. The air was heavy, not with fear, but with the weight of having done something irreversible, something right. The boy's voice broke the silence. "Why did you help me?" he asked softly. Bear looked at him, his eyes reflecting years of pain and redemption. "Because once," he said, "someone helped me when I didn't deserve it. Now it's my turn to make it right." The room fell still. The boy didn't understand the full meaning of those words yet, but he felt their truth deep in his chest. Outside, the night stretched endless and calm. The bikes rested side by side, their chrome glinting under the pale moonlight. For once, the engines were silent, but their message echoed louder than ever. Across the country, people began to question the system that had failed so many. Letters poured in to the Sons of Mercy, thanking them, begging them to keep fighting, to not disappear back into the shadows. And somewhere, miles away, in another courthouse just like the first, a judge sat in his chambers staring at the same headline. His hands trembled. Maybe, for the first time in his career, he began to understand. Justice isn't written on paper. It's written in the choices of those brave enough to stand up when the world looks away. Days turned into weeks, yet the echo of that courthouse standoff refused to fade. Everywhere, people were talking, not about the law, but about justice. News anchors debated the limits of power, while parents told their children about the men who rode into a courthouse not to destroy, but to defend. For the first time in years, compassion had become a headline. The Sons of Mercy had unknowingly awakened something dormant, a hunger for humanity in a world that had grown numb. The boy now lived safely with Bear and the others, surrounded not by luxury, but by loyalty. Every morning, he'd sit on the steps of the garage watching them fix bikes, his laughter mixing with the sound of wrenches and engines. He wasn't afraid anymore. The nightmares that once made him cry out in the dark were replaced by the roar of motorcycles, a sound that, to him, meant safety. He no longer belonged to the system. He belonged to a family forged not by blood, but by choice. Bear grew quieter in those weeks. He'd watch the boy play, sometimes smiling, sometimes lost in thought. The media painted him as a vigilante, a hero, a criminal, all at once. But he didn't care. He had seen too much of the world's injustice to worry about names. What mattered was that, for the first time in his life, he had done something that truly mattered. He had turned pain into purpose, and that was worth more than any verdict or medal. One night, as the club gathered around a fire outside the garage, Bear told them, "We can't fix the whole world, but we can ride where the road is darkest." His words carried weight, not as a speech, but as a creed. The bikers raised their bottles, silent in agreement. They weren't rebels anymore. They were protectors, flawed, broken men who found redemption not through forgiveness, but through action. The boy, sitting by the fire, looked up at Bear and asked, "Does that mean there are more kids like me?" Bear nodded. "Too many," he said softly. "That's why we ride." And under the vast, star-scattered sky, the engines of mercy would once again prepare to roar, not for vengeance, but for the forgotten. The next mission came sooner than anyone expected. A news story broke about another child, a girl, lost in a web of corruption and neglect. The Sons of Mercy didn't hesitate. They didn't plan a protest or call the press. They just rode. Dozens of bikes tore through the night like lightning, their headlights slicing through fog and rain. The boy watched them go from the garage window, his heart pounding with both pride and fear. He knew they were riding for someone like him. Meanwhile, Bear led the convoy with calm precision. Every mile reminded him of why they existed, because the system never drove this road. The highways, the alleys, the forgotten towns, they belonged to people like him, people who had learned to survive outside the reach of law. But that didn't mean they had abandoned justice. It just meant they carried it differently, not in briefcases or courtrooms, but in the rumble of an engine and the courage to face wrong with action. When they arrived in the next town, they found the girl's story worse than they'd imagined. She'd been moved from home to home, used, ignored, and silenced. Her cries had vanished into paperwork. Bear didn't wait for permission. He went straight to the foster agency and demanded answers. His voice didn't rise, but every word was a strike of thunder. "You failed her," he said, "but we won't." The agency tried to call the police, but the Sons of Mercy weren't afraid of sirens. They knew that sometimes the law needed to be reminded of its heart. Within hours, the story hit the news again. Another rescue, another act of defiance wrapped in loyalty. The bikers didn't hide. They stood tall, not as criminals, but as men unafraid to challenge the machinery that chewed through lives without consequence. Back in the garage, the boy waited with the same teddy bear he'd once clung to in court. When he heard the engines returning, he ran outside and saw Bear stepping off his bike, carrying a small, frightened girl in his arms. Without words, he understood. The Sons of Mercy didn't just save children. They adopted them into the one family the world could never take away. The girl barely spoke for days. She would sit on the garage floor, tracing shapes in the dust while the others worked on their bikes. The boy, once rescued himself, understood her silence better than anyone. He began leaving small gifts near her spot: a flower, a marble, half a cookie. It took time, but one morning, she smiled at him. That tiny curve of her lips was enough to make every man in that garage pause. In that moment, they all saw it. Healing was louder than engines. Bear watched the two children from across the room. The hard lines in his face softened, his weathered eyes reflecting something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He had lived a life of battles, loss, and guilt, but here, watching those children find safety in a place the world called dangerous, he realized something profound. Redemption doesn't come from perfection. It comes from protection, from the decision to shield innocence, even when your own hands aren't clean. The story of the Sons of Mercy began spreading far beyond their town. People called them everything: saviors, sinners, heroes, criminals. But none of those labels mattered. What mattered were the letters that began arriving by the dozens, from families begging for help, from children thanking them, from strangers who said their courage had rekindled faith in humanity. Each letter was tacked to the wall of the garage, a mosaic of gratitude and pain, proof that their mission was no longer just their own. At night, Bear would sit outside, staring into the flames of the fire pit. He'd remember his younger days, the reckless rides, the violence, the choices that had left scars both visible and buried deep. For the first time, he didn't wish to erase any of it. Every mistake, every wound had led him here, to a garage filled with laughter, to a purpose that roared louder than regret. Sometimes, the darkest roads lead exactly where you're meant to go. And though none of the men ever said it aloud, they all knew what was happening. The Sons of Mercy were no longer just a motorcycle club. They were becoming something much greater, a force of conscience, a brotherhood bound not by rebellion, but by redemption. One morning, as the sun rose over the quiet town, Bear found an envelope taped to the garage door. It bore the seal of the courthouse, the same one they had once stormed. Inside was a letter written in formal, careful words. The Department of Child Services acknowledges that the actions taken by your organization have prompted a review of our procedures. Effective immediately, oversight will be expanded. We owe you thanks. Bear read the words twice, unable to believe them. Justice, once deaf and blind, had finally opened its eyes. He called the crew together and read the letter aloud. For the first time, no one cheered. They just stood in silence, understanding the weight of what had changed. The system they had fought against was starting to listen, and while that didn't erase the past, it meant the fight had not been in vain. The sound of their engines had reached further than they ever imagined, not just through cities and highways, but into the cold heart of bureaucracy itself. Later that day, the boy and the girl found Bear sitting outside, the letter folded neatly beside him. The boy climbed onto his lap and asked, "Does this mean we can stop riding now?" Bear smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No, kid," he said. "It means now we ride for everyone who still can't." The girl nestled close, resting her head against his shoulder. For them, justice wasn't an idea. It was a person living, breathing, and wearing leather. That night, the garage was alive with motion once again. The men worked quietly, polishing chrome, tightening bolts, checking engines. There was no need for speeches or plans. The mission was clear: keep riding, Keep protecting. Keep reminding the world that goodness doesn't always come dressed in white. Sometimes, it comes with scars and grease-stained hands. As the sun sank behind the hills, Bear stood at the head of the line of motorcycles. The boy and girl watched from the doorway as he started his engine, the others following one by one. The roar rose like a promise, deep, defiant, unstoppable. Justice didn't live in courthouses anymore. It lived on the open road, carried by those brave enough to chase it. The roar of the engines faded into the horizon, leaving behind the hum of destiny. Each mile they rode carried the memory of the children they had saved and the ghosts they had left behind. Every town they passed looked at them differently now, not as outlaws, but as legends. People would gather when they stopped, offering food, gas, or just a simple thank you. Mothers would hold their children tighter, whispering stories about men who fought not for glory, but for justice. The Sons of Mercy had become a symbol of something sacred, the idea that goodness can rise from grit, that even the broken can protect the innocent. Bear felt the weight of that transformation. The fame didn't tempt him. It humbled him. He knew the world loved heroes until it didn't, that systems forgive only when it's convenient. But that didn't matter. They hadn't done this for recognition. They had done it because someone had to. As the wind whipped against his face, he remembered the boy's words. "Can we stop riding now?" And whispered to himself, "Not yet, kid. Not while there's still someone left to save." One night, as they camped near the desert's edge, a young man approached their fire. He wore no leather, no patches, just the eyes of someone who had seen too much too soon. "You don't know me," he said, voice trembling, "but my sister was the girl you saved. She's safe now. She's smiling again." The men said nothing, but their silence carried more weight than applause ever could. The young man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. "She wanted you to have this," he said, placing it in Bear's hand. Inside was a tiny photograph, the girl, the boy, and a crudely drawn motorcycle between them. Bear swallowed hard. He closed the locket and held it like a sacred thing. "Tell her to keep smiling," he said, his voice low. The young man nodded, tears in his eyes. As he walked away, the night filled again with the crackling of fire and the distant cry of coyotes. The world was still cruel, but not completely. Somewhere between the noise and the silence, hope had found a home. When morning came, Bear rose early. The desert stretched wide and golden before him, endless as redemption. He started his bike and looked back at his brothers, men scarred by life, yet still standing. "Let's ride," he said simply. And as the sun climbed over the horizon, the Sons of Mercy thundered forward, chasing the kind of justice that no court could ever grant. Years later, the boy, now grown, would stand before a crowd on the same courthouse steps where everything had begun. Behind him, the sound of motorcycles echoed softly, like ghosts blessing the air. In his hand, he held the same teddy bear from that day, old, worn, but still whole. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned in, but he didn't speak to them. He spoke to the children watching from behind the barricades, the ones whose eyes carried the same fear he once knew. "My name is Jack," he said. "Once, I was just another kid the system forgot. But one day, men the world called outlaws rode through those doors and reminded everyone what justice really means. They weren't perfect. They weren't saints. But they were brave enough to care when no one else did." His voice wavered, but he stood tall, just as Bear once had. "They taught me that family isn't who you're born to. It's who shows up when the world turns away." The crowd was silent. Even the reporters had lowered their cameras. Jack placed the teddy bear gently on the courthouse steps and smiled faintly. "Those men are gone now," he continued. "But their road didn't end. It just widened. Every time we stand for what's right, every time we protect someone who can't fight for themselves, we ride with them." He paused, looking at the horizon where faint sunlight glimmered on chrome. Because justice doesn't belong to the system. It belongs to the brave. Behind him, dozens of engines ignited, filling the air with thunder. The sound was not violent. It was alive. It carried the same promise Bear once made, the same vow that had turned pain into purpose. Jack put on a leather jacket, its back embroidered with the same emblem, Sons of Mercy. As he swung a leg over his bike, the crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in tears. They weren't witnessing rebellion. They were witnessing legacy. And as the Sons of Mercy rode once more into the open road, the sky split with light. The courthouse behind them stood as a monument, not of law, but of courage. And somewhere, in the endless hum of the wind, the voice of Bear could almost be heard, steady and unyielding. "Keep riding, son. The road to justice never ends." In the end, justice did not ride into the sunset. It kept riding, echoing through every life it had touched. The story of the Sons of Mercy became more than legend. It became a compass pointing toward something purer than law itself. The unshakable truth that doing what is right will always matter more than being told what is legal. Bear's road may have ended, but his spirit lived on through every soul that refused to stand by in silence. Because justice, when carried by courage, never fades, it simply finds new riders. Years passed, and yet the roar of their engines could still be heard in the hearts of those who believed in mercy over fear. The world changed because of them, maybe not in headlines, maybe not in policies, but in people. Every child who felt forgotten now knew that somewhere out there, someone would fight for them. Every man or woman who had once looked away from injustice now thought twice before doing nothing. That was their real victory. Not the court they defied, but the conscience they awakened. Jack, now grown and carrying the legacy of those who saved him, knew that the meaning of justice wasn't something you could write in a book or engrave on a courthouse wall. It was written in moments, in the sound of engines roaring against corruption, in the courage of ordinary hearts choosing compassion over comfort. And as he looked back at the road that had brought him here, he understood that some roads never end. They just keep leading others home. Because true justice is not about rules. It's about responsibility. It's about remembering that silence is the ally of cruelty, and that every act of courage, no matter how small, keeps the world turning toward the light. The Sons of Mercy didn't just save a child. They reminded the world that heroes aren't born. They're made, one brave choice at a time. Their story isn't just a tale of rebellion. It's a reminder that sometimes thunder speaks louder than words. If this story moved you, share it. Not for fame, but for faith. Leave your thoughts below and tell the world what justice means to you. And if you believe that courage deserves to be remembered, join this journey. Subscribe, like, and stay with us. Because as long as stories like this are told, the road of mercy will never end. And somewhere, out there, the engines of justice are still riding.